schedule is giving a toast. So that means I'm giving a toast. To be perfectly honest, I don't know what it means to give a toast. But that's not because I've thought long and hard about what the phrase giving a toast means and come to the conclusion that it's incoherent, or even worse, there isn't anything it could possibly mean. It's just because I've had very little exposure to real life toasts. Much more exposure actually to the so-called l'chaim. But luckily enough, actually, I think there's probably no philosopher more fitting, at least no philosopher here, more fitting for a l'chaim. L'chaim meaning to life. Right? It seems most fitting to celebrate the life of a metaphysician who's probably done more than anyone since Aristotle to put life and living things at metaphysical center stage. I don't know if there are any Hegelians here, but I'm sure Peter will forgive me for neglecting Hegel. And I think Peter has certainly done more than anyone in recent times to make clear that our human lives, what we are and what we can do, are where the metaphysical rubber hits the road, so to speak. So I'm going to make a l'chaim instead of a toast. That's why, well, it'll also save everyone the discomfort of me trying to be witty. The truth is, the connection between Peter's philosophical work and life, and specifically to a life well lived, I think runs deeper than we might be able to gather just from surveying his favorite topics and views. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily quote Psalms in a philosophical toast, or even in a philosophical l'chaim. But since I think Peter is a fan of Psalms, at least some of them, I'm going to beg your indulgence and just quote a verse or two from Psalms 90, which I know is on his mind. It says, "The days of our years are 80 years, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years." That's 80. So teach us to number our days. Now, if you've reached the age of 80, kanai nahara, as you'd say in Yiddish, and you reflect on what made your life what it is, I think you'd probably point to the major events, like, the birth of a child, the seminal publication, or what have you. I don't think you necessarily point to all the humdrum days, but it seems like the psalmist is, hoping to learn how to number each of his days, right? Even the uneventful ones. If you set aside time travelers and the general resurrection, again, I hope Peter will allow me to do so. Life is lived one day after another, including all the humdrum days. And if anything captures how Peter works and how he teaches his students who are fortunate enough to study with him, it's his attention to detail. As invariably turns out to be the case, Peter sniffs out the detail that really truly matters, the one that turns the whole discussion on its head, or even launches a whole new research program. I remember when Peter came into the seminar one day and told us in a somewhat exasperated way that Derek Parfit had incorporated or addressed very few of Peter's many, many comments and corrections on a manuscript on what matters. Now, I can certainly imagine Parfit receiving these comments and thinking, I'm literally writing a book on what matters, and Peter's focused on whether neo-Meinongianism is coherent. But sometimes, and in Peter's hands, I think always, those seemingly marginal details really do matter. So Peter certainly has no small number of seminal publications, and over the course of his career, he's constructed and continues to construct a magnificent philosophical edifice. But for many of us, and many of his students, I think, especially, just as instructive as the edifice itself is the way it was constructed, by building it day in and day out, carefully crafted brick by carefully crafted brick. It's philosophy done the way a truly rich life is lived. So Peter, to many more years of life well lived, day by day, enlarging the philosophical edifice you've made, surrounded by all of us and all of those whose lives you shaped and who adore you and love you. L'chaim.
Hear, hear. I was deeply influenced by Peter's standards of precision and the ability to perceive the heart of an issue, and I try to emulate those things. I'm not sure how successfully I've done so, but they continue to be an inspiration, those standards. And I'm sure that I've picked up a few Van Inwagen mannerisms in my teaching as well. Those maybe I'll pass over though. One of my proudest moments was when since being a graduate student under his supervision at Syracuse University, was at a recent conference in Madrid when I defended a view according to which extended material things lack proper parts. Not that they didn't have things like legs and hearts and kidneys, but those things were simply not proper parts of the extended things which they, to some extent, shared locations with. And his remark as we walked out of the lecture hall was, "Well, thank you, Andrew, for putting one more crazy position on the map." Before I pass on the microphone, I wanted to say something about how Peter's friendship has affected and meant a lot to both myself and my wife, Carolyn. When my wife, Carolyn, was pregnant with our first child, as when we were in Syracuse in graduate school, she converted to Catholicism. And unbeknownst to me or her, we found out the next Monday when I was in the seminar room getting coffee that Peter had quietly snuck into the church to witness the ceremony personally. And I learned that only after the fact. So this quiet but gracious gesture meant a lot, as do small things like asking Carolyn, my wife, if he could sit by her when getting together for lunch in a large group at a conference in the city after seeing each other for a long time. So I do especially want to convey my wife's affection for you and appreciation for these gracious gestures. So in closing, thank you, Peter, for your great example and friendship over the years. And I'll raise my glass in toast as well. Happy birthday.
I will just say very quickly that Peter was my advisor at Notre Dame. He was an excellent advisor. Overall, I guess I would say a bit on the stoic side of things. And however, so I got my first job at Niagara University before I had finished my PhD. I came back to South Bend to graduate, and then the department secretary from Niagara University, I got this phone call from her, and she's like, "There's a gentleman who's desperately trying to get in touch with you by the name of Peter van Inwagen." And I was like, "Oh yeah, put him through, give him my number." Peter had, I believe it was a funeral that had come up unexpectedly and wasn't going to be able to hood me, and so just really wanted to get in touch with me to let me know that he wasn't going to be able to do that. And I was, semi taken aback at it. My first PhD graduation, I didn't know the norms. I didn't know he was expected to be there to put me in the first place. But in any case, after the ceremony, Peter and Lizette took Lorraine and I out to a very nice dinner. I still remember, I think I still have the menu. It was a personalized menu. Congratulations, John, on the menu. And I don't know. It was an extremely touching event, and in lieu of a lot of other things I could say, I just want to say thank you again for being an excellent advisor, and happy birthday.
Yeah, so I was an undergrad at Duke University around 2012, 2016, and I was very privileged to be able to sit in on some graduate seminars that Peter taught, from Kripke's philosophy and David Lewis's philosophy to free will to metaphysics. And I obviously learned a whole lot, both in and out of those classrooms. So I was one of the undergrads that would, I'm probably the only undergrad in those classes, but I would definitely bother Peter after hours in the office hours and send him philosophical ramblings via email. And he was always very responsive to those. We had long email threads about modal space and Bayesianism and nominalism and all sorts of things. And he was always very responsive to that and very generous with his time.
Presentism? Did you get him?
We didn't get to that. Do you think presentism is unintelligible? With text existence?
You still have some correspondence to do.
So Peter thinks presentism is unintelligible. So yeah, I wanted to say two things about how Peter's work has influenced me philosophically, or both his work and conversations with him. So when I started out as an undergrad, I was a pretty gung-ho Carnapian about metaphysics. That it's all verbal, there's no deep questions, it's just pragmatic, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, paradigm case is a special composition question, you have tables, chairs, you can talk both ways, doesn't really matter. And I think Peter basically disabused me of that as an undergrad, which I'm very thankful for. I think I found it really hard to continue in my Carnapianism once you sort of get into the trenches of the first order metaphysical debates. So once you realize, look, there's all these problems with this view and all these arguments against this view, and this view faces all these challenges that the other view doesn't, then it's hard to think, at least for me, that they were just sort of verbal variants, and I started to take metaphysics more seriously. So thankful for Peter for that. Another way that Peter has influenced me philosophically is, so Peter denies the existence of lots of things that a lot of people take for granted. Obviously things like tables and chairs, but lots of other things like events or mental states or lots of other kinds of categories of things that lots of philosophers take for granted. And I'm sort of, here's a quote, I think somewhere in his book, where something along the lines of, if there are no artifacts, then there are no philosophical problems about artifacts. Therefore, we should reject all artifacts. And I've very much taken that sort of methodology to heart. I've sort of ended up with a actually much more radically minimalistic view than even Peter has. I'm inclined to think there's only one thing that exists, so even crazier than Peter. So I've very much taken that lesson to heart. So I think I've probably taken it to conclusions that Peter doesn't like, but that's also influenced me as well. And so lastly, just on a personal note, Peter very much encouraged me to enter grad school and was very supportive in my applications and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know about the counterfactual of where I would have ended up without Peter, and so I'm very thankful to him for that personal reason.
This is not going to be a toast, it's not going to be a roast, it's just going to be a very personal, detailed thank you to Peter. For better or for worse, I wouldn't be a philosopher if it hadn't been for Peter. I don't think I ever told Peter how much his encouragement and support meant to me. My freshman year in college, I came from a small rural high school. I had not had advanced courses in anything. I found myself at Syracuse because I had entered as a music major and decided not to do that between the time I got accepted and the time I had to decide where to go to college. And so I was just taking the Syracuse University required, they had the curriculum segmented, and it worked out that one of the things I had to take was philosophy. I had no idea what it was. I was pretty sure it involved togas and foreign languages. And what I discovered, I think probably on day one, was no, it was about asking questions, and people had to give you relevant answers. And if you didn't like the answers, you could say something back, and then they said something relevant back to you. And this was amazing to me, because all my life I had gotten in trouble for arguing with people. And I didn't argue because I was trying to be a wise ass. I mean, most of the time that was not why I was arguing, but I would ask questions. I was raised a Catholic, and I had lots of questions about various things. I didn't understand what the Trinity was. I didn't understand how God could justifiably sequester unbaptized, blameless infants in limbo. And I would just be told basically to stop asking questions as I was growing up. So for Peter to validate the legitimacy of my asking these questions was huge. The other thing was, because I was so insecure about my own intellectual background, the idea that Peter seemed to feel that I was worth taking seriously and talking to was just tremendously supportive of me. And early on, he encouraged me to think about being a major in philosophy and then going on in philosophy. And for some reason, I was talking to somebody else about this. For some reason, it took me about 1.5 years to realize that one could actually get a salary for teaching philosophy. I don't know what I thought. Did I think Peter was a volunteer? I mean, but it was like, I think it was the middle of my sophomore year, and Peter had been encouraging me to apply to a program that Syracuse ran that enabled 1 or 2 students every year to go study at the University of London at Bedford College for a year, and Peter, encouraged me to do that. I took a course, at least one course from you, every semester that I was in residence at Syracuse. Peter always convinced me of whatever position we were studying, and then we'd study another position, and all of a sudden, he convinced me of the other thing. And I try to convince my friends of these positions doing what I thought Peter had been doing with me, and they somehow didn't get convinced, and I couldn't figure out where the deficiency was. Was it me or was it them? Peter just kept encouraging me. I would have some really, really down days, and I would go to Peter's office when I felt that way, because I knew I would get somebody engaging with me and taking me seriously, and it would be fun. Now, I had the good fortune, because Peter wrote some, I'm sure, extremely hyperbolic letters of reference on my behalf, to go to graduate school at Harvard. And actually, the spring of my senior year, I don't know if you remember this, Peter told me, there's this guy he's giving a talk, you have to go see him. His name is Noam Chomsky. And that also blew my mind. That changed my life. I thought, I didn't know there was this in the world. The SU Psych department at that point was still pretty behavioristic. The linguistics department did mostly socio and historical linguistics. So I didn't know that this was a thing. So anyway, Peter paid somebody or something, and I got into Harvard. And, and so there was Harvard going on, with a roster of names that, made me sure that there'd been a clerical error. But then down the road at MIT, the cognitive revolution was happening. And the Harvard department at this point was very Wittgensteinian and had arguments, well, not arguments exactly, but took the position that there couldn't be a science of the mind or a science of language. And I kept looking down the road and saying, but there. So that was a very fruitful antagonism for me, and I realized something about myself, that I like to be in the center of a controversy. That's very energizing. But wait a minute, I had a point. Anybody remember? No. I know. So I had no trouble arguing with Hillary Putnam, with John Rawls, with Jerry Fodor, with Ned Block, who else was there? With Robert Nozick. But I remain terrified to this day to argue with Peter.
Same.
All he has to do is cock an eyebrow, or worse, say, so what you're saying is, and I know I'm done for. But anyway, as I said, I don't know if I can convey how very, very important to me personally, as well as professionally, Peter's support and encouragement was, and I will be eternally grateful. So happy birthday.
Thank you so much. Most of you will probably know this already. I was a graduate student at Syracuse when Peter was there. He really made an impression on me. It wasn't just his reliable displays of enormous intelligence sprinkled with wit, but He was also, as has already been noted, reliably extraordinarily clear, displayed immense attention to detail, and could throw topics in sharp relief by formalizing topics, regimenting them, using even fairly elementary logical resources in many cases. There were many good philosophers at Syracuse, but I kind of had the thought, I want to do philosophy like that guy. And he served as a benchmark for me ever since, and I hope it's held me in good stead. And I'm also enormously grateful to for the encouragement and support he's given me over the years. My partner Christina, I know, would have very much liked to be here. It was not practically possible for us both to be here. I know that she would like me to let you know that, and also convey her gratitude for the support and encouragement that you've given her, Peter. So happy birthday. Cheers. I have some wine. I wasn't quite sure what to talk about tonight. I just figured I'd do some philosophy. The paper I'm going to draw upon is in many places immensely technical, and it's also extraordinarily long. It's a paper written by my USC colleague, Jeff Russell. I'm going to, for much of this talk, focus on the first 15% of that paper because it's easier to make informal remarks around that 15%. And also, I'll just gesture in the direction of some of the parts that follow. So in his influential 1955 Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, Nelson Goodman famously distinguished between what he thought of as projectable generalizations and other generalizations, where the guiding idea was that only projectable generalizations are confirmed by their instances. Summing up, he wrote, only a statement that is law-like is capable of receiving confirmation from an instance of it. Accidental statements are not. Plainly, then, we must look for a way of distinguishing law-like from accidental statements. Since this raises the question, of course, how do we say something about the distinction between projectable generalizations and the rest? Since David Lewis famously introduced the distinction between natural and non-natural properties, and indeed a scale of naturalness for properties, many philosophers have had the idea that somehow natural properties could be co-opted into an enlightening account of projectable generalizations. Such philosophers have often had the thought that disjunctive properties, as judged by a language of metaphysics in which primitive predicates correspond to natural properties, would on the other hand be inappropriate fodder for projectable generalizations. And Jeff and I tasked ourselves with the project of trying to explore what connection, if at all, there is between the natural and the projectable. Let's start with Ted Sider here, who articulates the purported connection very clearly in his writing The Book of the World. By the way, Lewis introduces the natural, non-natural, vaguely gestures in a few places at its relevance to Goodman's riddle of induction, but never really develops ideas very much. So there's not very much in the actual original Lewisian corpus to go with here. Here's Ted. Suppose that an observation confirms any logical equivalent of any sentence that it confirms. Then, as Hempel 1945 pointed out, the observation of red roses confirms all ravens are black. Nicot's principle, which is roughly that generalizations are confirmed by their instances, implies that, and as Goodman pointed out, Nicot's principle, I've just told you what it is, implies that observations of green emeralds before 3000 AD confirm all emeralds are GRU, where GRU is defined as either green and before 3000 AD or blue or otherwise blue. So Ted goes on. I'm sort of riffing a little bit here. I'm skipping around. These conclusions can be avoided by restricting Nicot's principle to predicates for natural properties and relations. Since is non-black and is a non-raven and GRU fail to express natural properties, the restricted principle does not apply to generalizations containing them. In Goodman's terminology, only terms for natural properties and relations are projectable. So there's a very clear articulation of the idea in Ted. I want to really bear down on some of those remarks. I think Ted is very influenced by Goodman here. Goodman's thinking, hey, the Hempel on the ravens and GRU really teach us that we need some serious restricting here. And what I want to convince you of, at least initially, is Goodman made a series of elementary blunders. One thing that really struck me working through this stuff is that while people's impression is that Goodman was the hero and Carnap the sort of language fetishizing villain or something, in fact things are the other way around. Carnap had nearly all the key structural insights. Goodman made a series of important confusions that have seriously misled philosophers in this area. So Jeff wouldn't let me write it like that, so, but it's a talk. So, okay. Let's start with just before I get to Goodman, I want to talk about in my mind, three confusions that you find in Goodman. Before that, I think it's worth paying attention to the ideology of an instance of a generalization. What exactly is an instance of a generalization? All F's or G's is logically equivalent to everything's either not F or G. So it's natural to think that an instance is a piece of information of the form X is either non-F or G. What I can tell you is if you think of that as an instance, there is no need to restrict the Nicot's principle construed that way at all. I don't think that's how Ted was taking it, but I think it's important to realize that on that construal, the principle holds pretty much universally and without exception. And there's a simple reason for that, is that if you find the opposite's the case, it's not the case that this is either not F or G, that's extraordinarily bad news for the generalization. And if the opposite of something is bad news for a generalization, then by elementary reflection on the probability calculus, you can start to see that an instance in this sense has to be good news. There are edge cases where it's the prior is 0 and so it goes undefined, or priors involve ones. When ones and zeros, there is some qualification, but basically it's fine. As stated, no need to restrict at all. There's another notion of instance that I think Ted's working with, where all F's or G's and instance is a particular thing that's F and G. I think that's the notion of instance that he's working with. And it's not a theorem of the probability calculus, and an instance of that sense confirms the generalization. The principle that everything is green and such that not everything is green. You might think that is not a contradiction. If you think that's a contradiction, you're forgetting the fact that generalizations can be vacuously true. So that had a shot, as it were, from the point of view of the priors. It had a shot of being true. But you see, find an instance of that, this thing is green and such that not everything is green, that's going to be a disaster for the generalization. So we know it's not construe instance that way. We can't just make elementary inferences from the probability calculus. Nevertheless, I think it's too hasty to think that, as it were, it would be a problem to think that an instance of the logically equivalent generalization to all ravens are black, i.e. all non-black things are non-ravens, an instance of that in Ted's sense is it a problem to think an instance of that confirms not only the twisted generalization, but the generalization that it's equivalent to? I think that isn't so clear. Let's look at Goodman on this. Famously, Goodman was thinking, if you start thinking this way, that a non-black non-raven confirms all ravens are black, you'll be starting to think that you can do indoor ornithology. You can think, oh, hold on, here's a non-black non-raven. That confirms all non-black things are non-ravens, and so by the equivalence idea confirms all ravens are black. Hey, I've got support for a piece of ornithology just by looking at this lectern, and that seems wrong. I don't think this is a good argument. It sounds beguiling, and people have been beguiled by it, but actually, if you think it through, it's no good. The indoor ornithology objection is no good. I think a first thing to be very clear about is that Bayesian confirmation, and I'm working throughout in a sort of Bayesian framework where I'm thinking that issues about induction can be helpfully formulated as issues about what constraints there are on rational priors, as it were, and where information update proceeds by conditionalization. I'm idealizing away from all sorts of things. I'm idealizing away from the fact that our information is often indexical, and that's not trivial to accommodate in a Bayesian model. I'm idealizing away from the fact that information is often presented under various guises, and the guise under which an information is presented can be important. So I'm aware that in certain ways I'm being naive, but as with much philosophy, one has to sort of pick one's battles. Okay, how about the indoor ornithology objection? Important to realize Bayesian confirmation isn't monotonic. P can confirm Q, but that doesn't mean P and R confirms Q, as most straightforward counterexample is where R is not Q. And so when you learn that some things are red rose, and when you learn that some things, you're not just learning that it's a non-black, non-raven. You're learning something more. There's additional information. And we've got to be very careful about what is and isn't accomplished in terms of screening out by the additional information. So we have to be much more careful than Goodman is to control for the fact that confirmation is non-monotonic. Let's look at a pure case. I hadn't looked at my lectern. I put my hand on the lectern and I ask Peter to pretend that there are things like computers and stuff, but also, and as well as the ravens he does believe in, and tell me whether the closest thing to my hand is a non-black, non-raven. And suppose he says yes. Or I could ask him another question. Is it either non-black, a non-raven or black? And he could answer that. Is there something paradoxical about that having some bearing on the credence I give to those particular bits of information on the credence I give to the generalization, all ravens are black? And I think if you think things through, you can see that it might. I mean, here's a toy model. I'm pretty certain there's about 1 billion things in the world. I'm not certain whether or not, I have very, very low credence that there's a raven on my lectern, but I have a little bit of credence on that. I close my eyes, I put there, I get those bits of information, and they'll have slightly different impact, but they'll tell me something, as it were. Suppose I learn, oh, it's a non-black, non-raven. Well, that's one. We've got one down, and then a billion minus one to go as potential counterexamples. It'll have a little bit of impact. I mean, it just will. If I was certain that it won't, then that there was no raven on my desk, it'll have no impact. If I had a small credence, it'll have a small impact. And so there'll be a tiny bit of confirmation. Just crank things through using sort of Bayesian updating, and it will have a little bit of impact. There will be a little bit of confirmation. No obvious need yet for a restriction. Let's turn to Goodman's famous, I've got some quotes here, that's why I'm scrolling, to Goodman's famous puzzle itself. I want to draw attention to two elementary blunders in his discussion. Here's Goodman. Confirmation of a hypothesis by an instance depends rather heavily upon features of the hypothesis other than its syntactical form. That a given piece of copper conducts electricity increases the credibility of statements asserting that other pieces of copper conduct electricity, and thus confirms the hypothesis that all copper conducts electricity. But the fact that a given man now in this room is a third son does not increase the credibility of statements asserting that other men now in this room are third sons, and so does not confirm the hypothesis that all men now in this room are third sons. Let's think about the copper case. He switches between two issues. One issue is whether the information that this copper conducts electricity provides support for the hypothesis that if that copper conducts electricity. And then there's the other issue. Does the information that this copper conducts electricity confirm the generalization that all pieces of copper conduct electricity? He's proceeding as if those questions are the same, more or less the same. They are not the same. It's crucially important, as Carnap saw, to distinguish those two questions. I can illustrate this quite easily with a very simple model. Let's suppose there are just two emeralds in a box, Emmy and Emerald. I know that there's exactly two emeralds in a box. I don't know whether they're blue or green. Let's define green as green and Gru star as being either Emmy and green or emerald and blue. I look at Emmy and notice that Emmy is green. There's absolutely no problem at all that confirms the generalization that all emeralds in the box are Gru star. No problem at all. Indeed, the probability calculus forces us to that conclusion, because after all, if I found out that Emmy was blue, that would be terrible news for the generalization that all emeralds in the box are Gru star, and you can finish off the argument in the way that I did earlier. But how about the instance of instantial confirmation? What would be really bad would be that discovering that Emmy was green raised the probability that emerald was green, and also raised the probability that emerald was Gru star. Because for emerald to be Gru star, emerald's got to be blue, and for emerald to be green, emerald's got to be green. So it can't, while it confirms both generalizations, it can't confirm, provide instantial confirmation in the sense that I explained to you. And Goodman runs the two issues together. Let's just have a simple toy model of how some priors might work. These are priors that aren't arbitrarily chosen. They're ones that a certain Carnapian idea recommends that I'll come to later. Let's suppose there are four possibilities, both green. Emmy's green, emerald's blue, emerald's green, Emmy's blue, both blue. And suppose I'm, what do I want? I want a third, both green, a third, both blue, a sixth, emerald green, Emmy blue, and a sixth, one of each, but with the identities reversed. Okay. I learned that Emmy's green, confirms both generalizations just fine. But how about instantial confirmation? I started off that if you had those priors, you'll start off assigning a half to emerald's green. But when I learn that M is green, I knock out both blue. I knock out one of the one green, one blue hypotheses, and I go to 2/3 on emerald being green. So we get asymmetry in instantial confirmation and symmetry in generalization confirmation. You don't get that straight, you make a real mess of things, and that's what Goodman's doing. There's a related blunder. Goodman's thinking that somehow there's something paradoxical about a bit of information simultaneously confirming two incompatible generalizations. Here he is discussing Hempel. On Hempel's theory, the prediction that all emeralds subsequently examined will be green and the prediction that all will be grue are alike confirmed by evidence statements describing the same observations. He's treating that as a reductio. In fact, he's just stating something that's pretty much a theorem of the probability calculus. You know, learning that everyone in the room belongs to the same political party simultaneously confirms the hypothesis everyone in the room is a Democrat and the hypothesis that everyone in the room is a Republican. There's no problem. The thing that he thinks is a problem for Hempel is not a problem at all. All right, so we're still in need of some really substantial guidance about why and whether there's a need to restrict various versions of Nocot principle, and how, if at all, natural properties are going to play a starring role. I'm just going to have a Dean,
Yeah.
how long do you... Suppose I plan to speak for 50 minutes.
Yeah, perfect. It's 8:09. If you go to 8:30, we still have a half hour to talk.
Okay, I might go to 8:30. Can you give me a heads up when it's 8:30? It's and I can just stop at some point. I mean, there's...
How about 8:30?
There are lots of ideas, but I want to explore a few of them. One unpromising idea, a few more promising ideas about how natural properties can play a role. And I want to emphasize what happens to the status of disjunctive properties on these various proposals, because I think it's interesting. First, the unpromising idea. When Kian and I wrote a paper on naturalness, we warned against some very simplistic ways of trying to connect naturalness with induction via some simple recipe connecting naturalness with priors. A very bad idea is anything along the lines of the more natural, the higher prior. Anything like that, if you hear it's bad. So here's Darren Bradley writing in Mind 2020, naturalness as a constraint on priors. We can apply a similar strategy to assigning credences. Describe each hypothesis using perfectly natural properties and assign a score based on the syntactic simplicity of this eligible description. So say the hypothesis in the language of metaphysics and see how much of a mouthful it is. That's the kind of idea. So a certain hypothesis gets the higher prior in virtue of being describable in syntactically similar terms using perfectly natural properties. You can't go for anything like that. I mean, compare, everything square and everything square or red. The one, and just pick your favorite primitives from the Book of the World or from TED or whatever. I mean, the probability calculus kind of says there's no way you can give a lower credence to everything's red or square than you can to everything square. There's just no way. But what Bradley is recommending then is something that goes directly contrary to the probability calculus itself. So if natural properties come in here, it's got to be in a very subtle way. Now let's talk about a few better ideas. I don't think I need this anymore now. In slogan form, one has to do with regularity and one has to do with symmetry, and they both play a role in Carnap's important discussions of induction in his Logical Foundations of Probability in 1950, and then in the discussions, the follow-up discussions of the Carnapian project, including by Carnap himself, in the Carnap and Jeffrey edited studies in inductive logic and probability, published a year after Carnap's death he died in 1970. This collection was published in 1971. First, the regularity idea. What I'm going to do, by the way, I'm going to put these ideas in ways that Carnap wouldn't himself approved of, but they have a strong structural affinity with those investigations, but I'm going to put them in ideology that's that'll be very friendly to metaphysics, as it were. So first, the regularity idea. It's a common sort of epistemological idea in Bayesian epistemology that you should give non-zero credence to every real possibility. But at least in the standard mathematical framework for probability, you can't do that because there's too many possibilities. If there's uncountably many possibilities and you give non-zero credence to each of them, then you're going to violate even finite additivity that says, basically you're not going to be able to have all your credences between 0 and 1 inclusive, and for any pair of incompatible things have the credence in the disjunction be the sum of the credences in the disjuncts. So we have to restrict regularity in some way, but you might think, and it's kind of a cool idea, that natural properties could play a role in some restricted regularity idea. And I'll just say it like boldly in Book of the World kind of language. Let's say that a finite proposition is a proposition expressible in a finite sentence in the language of metaphysics. That's a finite proposition. And now we've got a regularity idea on the table that you should give, the rational person should give non-zero credence to every finite proposition. That's an idea articulated using naturalness. It isn't going to crash in anything like the way that Bradley did. A few observations about that. One thing about that is generalizations using highly gerrymandered disjunctions of predicates in the Book of the World, they'll come out great too. If you're going to give non-zero credence to everything's F, you're definitely going to give non-zero credence to everything's F or G or H, blah, 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 blah. So it's not going to, that finite disjunctions are going to be fine. And you'll also cotton on to the right things plausibly, even if you didn't have in some cases, even if you didn't have the right predicates. If the only natural properties were green and round, then if you were setting your credences using primitive predicates for non-green and non-round, everything's going to go fine. If the natural properties were loving and green, then setting your credences by loving, the just hypotheses about loving and something is green if and only if it loves someone, everything will go fine still. So there's no need to start with the language of metaphysics to cotton on to obey finite regularity, as it were, and disjunctive properties, finitely disjunctive properties come out rosy. The only things to start to worry a bit about are extremely gerrymandered propositions, propositions that are such a mouthful to say in the language of metaphysics that you can't write down a finite string that expresses it. So that's the idea. What does it buy for you? You might think, you don't want it to just sit there. You want to try and do something with it. I'll quickly mention what it might buy for you, and then I'll move on to the next idea. Let me tell you a bit of Bayesian law that's got nothing to do with finite regularity. Suppose, just to idealize, I'm about to make an infinite series of observations and about an infinite sequence of questions. I'm going to get the answer to an infinite sequence of questions. Let's call a hypothesis empirical if its truth value is the function of the answers to those questions. There's a cool bit of Bayesian law that says, roughly, if you give a non-zero credence to an empirical hypothesis, I'm going to leave out a few slight wrinkles, your credence in that hypothesis will converge to 1 as you move through the observations. And subjective Bayesians have used this to sort of say, hey, don't worry too much about my subjective Bayesism, because things will iron out in the wash as I keep observing. That's the kind of idea to sort of offset the hit of subjective Bayesianism, which says that roughly any probabilistically coherent starting point is rationally permissible. The trouble is, as Gordon Bellett emphasizes, that this is to paint a too rosy picture. If you had 0 in a certain hypothesis to begin with, you're not going to get it back. So, as it were, if you put your eggs in the wrong baskets, then you're not going to get back on the right track just by looking at a bunch of stuff. That's the essential. That's what he calls the problem of augulity. So if you're a subjective Bayesian, you'll be supremely confident that you'll cotton on to the truth, because of course these other things, you'll be giving them 0. So you'll be thinking, oh, don't worry about those, no chance of those. But if the actual world corresponds to various 0 hypotheses, then you can easily get into trouble, even though you're supremely confident from the inside. So here's how finite regularity might help out a bit. The background idea and various hypotheses about laws ranging from Armstrong to Lewis lend some credence to this, is that the true statement of the laws is a finite proposition. I'm not going to try and argue for that, but you can sort of see, if you know about best system or laws of these special relations between privileged universals, that kind of stuff will really encourage you to think that the laws are a finite. A statement of the laws can be a finite proposition in the sense that Now, any consequence, I didn't say that the laws are an empirical hypothesis, but any consequence of the laws will have to get more credence than, or at least as much credence as the statement of the laws itself. And what that means is that if you obey finite regularity and the laws are bound to be finite propositions, then you're bound to converge to 1 on any empirical consequence of the true laws, which is a cool thing. It's not a thing you'd get out of just the convergence theorems of Bayesianism taken by itself, but you will get it out of this complex of finite regularity and this So, you know, speculative but intriguing hypothesis connecting the language of metaphysics to the true laws. Okay, so that's one idea. Where am I at?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Let me go to the other idea. I mean, we go on and on about this next idea, but I think it's good to get some of the essentials down. It's a Carnapian idea that Carnap realized that if, let's go to Emmy and Emerald again. Let's think of the state descriptions as just complete descriptions of which things have what. If you give equal credence to each state description, that's very bad for induction. Because, hey, you'll learn that Emmy is green, and it's still, well, there's one state description, Emmy's green, Emerald's blue, and the other Emmy's green, Emerald's green. So that's terrible for induction. Carnap had a cool idea, which is a precisification of a guiding idea among objective Bayesians that you want some kind of indifference principles, some kind of symmetry in your credences across important, some relevantly similar states of affairs. We can't just be indifferent across any old logical partition of reality, but we need to, in a slogan, be indifferent across symmetrical possibilities. Carnap's idea was this, and it's a cool idea. Take not the state descriptions, but the structure descriptions. That's what you get by sort of just taking out the names, putting them by bound variables, bound by an existential quantifier, that kind of thing. So in the case of Emmy and Emerald, we've got 3 structure descriptions that amount to 2 green things, 2 blue things, 1 green, 1 blue thing. 3 structure descriptions, and his idea was go indifferent on the structure descriptions, not the state descriptions, and then, as it were, divide your credence in the structure descriptions across the state descriptions that are sort of compatible with it. That's the basic idea. And that gives us the credence distribution that I mentioned earlier. A third Emmy green, Emerald green, a third Emerald blue, Emmy blue, a third 1 green, 1 blue, but that divides into 2 sub-possibilities in the way that the other doesn't. That's the whole trick. And then you can see you will get instance projectability. You find out Emmy's green, you'll get instance projectability of Emerald's green. There's a very famous criticism by Goodman of this whole idea. What he says is, okay, that's great if you start with green, blue as your predicates, but if you start with, I'll adapt it to this case, if you start with something like GRU as your thing, where to be GRU is to be either Emmy and green and Emerald and blue, then as it were, the uniform structure descriptions are going to be the situation where one's green and one's blue. Maybe I didn't do it quite right, but I didn't do it quite right there. But you can, let's have it either, being GRU is either being Emmy and green and such that Emerald's blue, or Emerald and green and such that Emmy's blue. Maybe, so long as it's one each way, they get to be both GRU. That's how I should be doing it. And then you'll get a reverse of the credence distribution. Goodman's conclusion is that it's all, this whole project is far too, is language dependent, just dependent on your choice of predicates in an unsavory way. What I think is important to realize is to answer that objection, you don't need anything like the ideology of natural properties. You just need the ideology of qualitative properties. If you've got the distinction between qualitative properties and non-qualitative properties, Goodman's objection doesn't go through. Let me tell you our way of presenting Carnap's idea. You can count the symmetry, and it works for small worlds, and then there's a lot on how you generalize. There's a lot of other stuff, I'm running out of time, so I've got tons more I could go through, but I want to get this idea out. Here's the idea. For a world, count its symmetries. A symmetry is a mapping from the things to the things that preserves the qualitative profile, intrinsic and relational, of the things. So when there's, if we had two green things, there's two symmetries. The mapping of things to themselves and the mapping that switches. If one's green, one's blue, there's only one symmetry. The basic idea is weight your credence in a world according to the number of symmetries in that world. On some, I can rigorously connect Carnap's presentation with that counting method on some assumptions, and I think it's interesting to see how to make the connection, because it, in a sort of interesting way, uses some of the ideology that's familiar to natural property lovers. Let's call a Carnap basis. A Carnap basis is a set of predicates that express qualitative properties that are freely recombinable and provide a supervenient space for all qualitative stuff. Okay? That's what a Carnap basis is. If you have a language that provides a Carnap basis and assign credences in accordance with the structure description regimen that Carnap advised, then it'll line up perfectly with the symmetry counting heuristic, and it will be utterly immune to Carnap's objections. So all you need to rehabilitate Carnap on this front is really the ideology of qualitative properties. It doesn't matter that the Carnap basis, whether the Carnap basis is natural or not. Supposing loving and green were the natural properties, then if you had loving and love someone if and only if green, I'm using a trick from Kean, by the way, there, then if those were your two primitive predicates, that's a supervenience basis that's freely recombinable. All will go well. You'll get exactly the same symmetry count out of that basis, and then the Carnap basis from my envisaged language of metaphysics. In this setting, nothing wrong with disjunctive properties. Learning some things, F or G, will instantially confirm the next things, F or G. Of course, that might be screened out by additional information, no problem whatsoever for instantial relevance. I think along these lines, we can actually go through the logical foundations of metaphysics, make use of familiar ideology like qualitative properties, keep Nelson Goodman's objections at bay, and re-articulate Carnap's ideas using ideas that don't seem at all language dependent and in fact utterly familiar to those equipped with the toolkit of contemporary metaphysics. I'm going to have to stop there. Thank you.
It's 8:29, John. That was very impressive. Unless you were looking at the clock.
No, I wasn't.
Well done. Okay, so we'll give people who need to call it a night a chance to get out. And it looks like there's still some water and coffee and wine and so on. So I will make a list of who wants to ask questions. I saw Richard first, and then I'll when I nod to you, you can put your hand up. Check, test, 1, 1, 1. There we go.
If I heard you right, John, going back to the things you said at the beginning, you were, if you're considering a generalization or a succeed, you were endorsing the idea that an A which is a B confirms, and you were endorsing the idea that an A which is not B clearly different.
Can I just speak to that? So what I was endorsing was, in fact, in full generality, was for the generalization all A's are B's, the information that A is such that it's G if F. That's an instance in the clean sense. What I said was that confirms without exception. The thing that you said doesn't confirm without exception.
In that case, I will withdraw my comment.
Yes.
Because
I-
there are
yes.
instances of where finding an A which is B disconfirmed.
Yes, and I gave one, if you remember. I mean, it's a cheesy one, but I was just off the top of my head trying to get something cheesy going, which is, I had as my property being green and such that not everything is green. I'm thinking of that as a property. And everything is green and such that not everything is green. That's a thing that has a shot of being true. After all, if nothing's green, it's in great shape. But if you find an instance in your sense of that, then if you find an instance, in Ted's sense, an instance is something that's both green and such that not everything's green, that will disconfirm. If you find an instance in the pure sense, just a thing that's such, you chose a thing is such that if it's green, it's such that not everything's green, that's different. Yeah?
It's a rather
Yeah.
cheesy predicate because I can give you a rather better
Yes,
example.
yeah, I'm sure there are better ones, but I was just alluding to the bit in the talk where I was trying to cover myself on that.
Your hypothesis is that all ravens live on Pitcairn Island. If your evidence is you've found lots of ravens that live on Pitcairn Island and you haven't got any other information, this seems to be evidence against the hypothesis that all ravens live on Pitcairn Island, because it suggests that there are lots elsewhere if you don't know anything else.
I see. If you start seeing a lot of them, you might think the best shot is there
Well,
are no ravens.
all your
Yeah,
evidence,
yeah,
that's reason to suppose they could be found
yeah.
elsewhere.
That seems
But
to
there's a
work too.
difference between that and knowing of a given raven that it lives on Pitcairn Island, that will always confirm. But the difference
Yes. We have another construal of instance confirmation that is like that too. Something that's already known to be an F, and then you discover that it's a G. If you already know that it's certain that it's an F, and then you inquire whether it's a G and you get a yes, that's got to be good news, except in 0-1 kind of edge cases. Yeah.
Barry. Hey, John, that was very interesting. A couple of things came to my mind. One is I think you were pretty unfair to Goodman.
I knew it.
Goodman was responding to people who had a syntactic account of confirmation. He was showing that was wrong-headed. He was completely right about that. You're thinking about confirmation as subjective probability raising. That's absolutely not how Goodman was thinking about it. Maybe that was too bad on his part, and Carnap was certainly close to being right. But both of them could have taken lessons from the other guy at Harvard at the time, who was very clear that background information made a big difference to whether or not evidence is evidence for a hypothesis or not. So that's one.
Yes, but
So
I mean, just in
think you're
favor.
really unfair to Goodman, actually.
Okay, I'll stand by my claim that these things are essentially blunders. I don't mean that there's no insight at all, but I do think these things have led philosophers astray. Maybe because
that's maybe the philosopher's fault.
yes, maybe it's their fault. But what you'll find is that there are a lot of people that have learned to think in probabilistic terms, but are still sort of still running with the so-called lessons of Goodman, and that's often an unhappy marriage. But maybe it was an after-dinner talk, so I thought, well, I'll try and be provocative.
I'm sorry, I don't want to make it hard.
Fair enough.
Into the Bayesian literature.
Yeah.
You are perfectly well aware of that. Think of Rosenkranz's book in 1968 or something like that. You won't find any blunder about that. The other
Look,
thing
I do want to say, he says Hempel is messed up because, look, according to Hempel's theory, these instances confirm both all emeralds are green and all emeralds are. That isn't yet a problem
Your
for.
thing of confirmation is probability raising. He wasn't thinking of it like that. And you're right, if that's what confirmation is. But that wasn't what he thought. He thought that it was not just...
I think he would have just retracted if I gave him the Democrat-Republican thing and said, "Oh, I messed up." That's what I'm.
He would not have been that stupid to have made that mistake. I mean, I actually met Goodman when I was an undergraduate.
Okay,
He was not a stupid guy.
No, I know.
Okay.
Okay, all right. I retract. I don't want to get into a fight over. I mean,
The other thing
you know
I thought was
Goodman
very
better than me.
interesting
That's all.
was your idea of replacing natural properties with qualitative properties. I do think that natural properties are pretty useless here. So I'm with you about that. But I don't see how you can apply this idea of qualitative properties to the kinds of magnitudes that come up in physics. I have no clue whether you want to count them as qualitative as not. Is electromagnetic field values qualitative?
So it's what's certainly true is that it's not an entirely good standing qualitative, non-qualitative. What I think is anyone who likes natural tends to like qualitative. There are plenty of people that like qualitative that are a bit more queasy about natural. And but I take your point that it's not impeccable. And in fact, Carnap himself was rather queasier about the qualitative, non-qualitative distinction than contemporary metaphysics. But I'm speaking to an audience that generally is comfortable with that distinction. And I think it's instructive to see that a ton of Carnap, for those who are comfortable with that, a ton can be rewritten in a way that bypasses accusations of being unduly reliant on syntax. Now, there still is the critique, it's the qualitative, non-qualitative distinction is when you really bear down on it and look at fundamental physics. You know, do you want to think of mass as qualitative or inhabiting points in a mass space as haxaetistic, and how do we, it might start to become too fuzzy to really be workable after all. So I accept the point that, well, things might break that way. And I'm sorry if I was a little cavalier about Goodman.
Thanks. Before I ask my question, I want to make sure, could you say what a symmetry is again? I want to make sure I understand.
A symmetry is a mapping from the things to the things that preserves the qualitative profile of the things.
So for there to be a symmetry, there have to be a pair of objects in a world that have the same maximal qualitative property.
Right, and so we talk about this. So it's a prima facie worry, and this was 1950 Carnap. Carnap evolved between 1950 and 1971 in ways that we explore that are very interesting. But one pressing issue about and I think you're cottoning onto it, is if I'm told that all emeralds have slightly different shapes, then I'm just completely out of luck for there being any symmetries.
Like
so
if you ask me, like, how many symmetries do you think this world has, I would be like 0. So now I've somehow gotten
yes. So what is true is the idea, as stated, only works in very simple toy models. And then there's the question, well, is there some cousin of the idea? And you can see it having a historical effect in various ways. And I stopped about part way through the paper. So, but you're exactly right that it's not very satisfactory as stated. But all I was trying to get across was this language dependence thing. Actually, that isn't the fundamental problem. If we're happy with a qualitative, non-qualitative, there may be other problems, but it's not the problem that Goodman was going for. Yeah.
Daniel, and if anybody else has questions, you have to wave to me.
This is a question about how finite regularity works. So the concern is that take any empirical theory that we have perhaps at one time or another wanted to believe. So take just like Newtonian mechanics. So we've got something like F equals ma, and so that looks really simple, it looks finite. But really this is saying there's a certain mapping into the real numbers. And to describe the real numbers, we need not just axioms, we need a schema. And so it looks like it's not the sort of thing that we can describe as using just a finite conjunction. And so I'm wondering if you're meaning to like allow for schemas, or if like it's not going to predict that, say, you shouldn't give 0 credence to Newtonian mechanics starting out, or like how, just sort of like how to apply it to this sort of case.
Yeah, I mean, one issue in the vicinity basically is if you have a signature of properties that's uncountable in itself, you're going to have potential issues. I mean, suppose we've got hypotheses about the mass of the universe, And even without numbers coming into play, suppose we have a primitive predicate for every real valued mass, then we've got uncountably many hypotheses. And so we can't obey finite regularity. So you're definitely right that only on certain metaphysical visions of how the structure of natural properties plays itself out can finite regularity as stated earn its cape. With all these ideas, you might think, well, is there some backup thing? Can we do a determinable thing? Can we do a what? And is this, but I think it's good to see the idea, good to see that the language dependence thing isn't, that can be bypassed in the way that Lewis tried to bypass the issue of which properties are disjunctive and non-disjunctive as the accusation that's just a superficial and linguistic thing by tying it to the language of metaphysics. So we can make similar moves in the current setting, but that's not to say that the thing is going to be immune to all worries, and it's sort of a start. You got to take the thing in the right spirit, and the spirit is, you see how we can transcend a sort of reliance on superficial syntax in a certain way, in a way that's somewhat similar to what Lewis was doing, and bypass some of the well-known objections to the Carnapian program along the way. Yeah.
I think I have the same question. That I think finite regularity has the same problem as regularity, given any realistic physics. So if we have uncountably many predicates or uncountably many names for individuals, like space-time points.
Right. So that's right. The name thing we do. One thing that could be said there. Remember, there's the ideology of structure descriptions and state descriptions. So one idea in the vicinity is, look at finite structural propositions where they're not haxaetistic. So we can do something by borrowing on that kind of idea. We can keep finite regularity going by making use of the idea of structure description. So I think that helps. I think it's real trouble if you don't have that resource. Now maybe it's going to die anyway on, Lewis seemed to be into it's a pretty short list, and there are these kind of congruence people that there are ideas out there for holding out hope that actually the really fundamental metaphysics is quite a short list. So I don't know, but I basically take your point, as I said before.
I guess I'm just going to ask what's it.
Talking stick.
Thanks. This is just to tell me more about the remaining 85% of the paper type of question. But so this particular, this part of the paper seemed, the lesson Barry took was, it confirms his thought that this notion of naturalness is no good, and really we just need this, maybe he thinks also the notion of qualitativeness is bad. Some, as it were, much less discriminating notion that naturalness is all we need, and that in both of the positive things, that seems to be the lesson. In one case, it's qualitativeness, and in the other case, it's something that yields the same, some sort of bunch of things that yield the same verdicts on what is and isn't a finite proposition, which is again going to be, it's going to let in many different and intuitively unnatural collections of propositions as well as the natural ones. So I guess, the question is, does it stay like that when you try to relax some of the sort of simplifications and idealizations that are required there? So particularly for Veronica, naturally, a natural thought is, well, we want something that doesn't just fall silent in the sort of plausible hypothesis that we should be very confident that there are no symmetries, or that there's only one. The only symmetry is the trivial one, according to your definition. Is the technology that helps us keep these ideas alive, once we go there, still going to be good news for the people who say this is all garbage except for something quite undiscriminating, or is there now going to be more of a role for the the traditional vision of the spectrum of naturalness, all of which matters.
Yeah, so what we weren't doing was really taking on those that are skeptical about the notion of qualitativeness itself. We're spotting ourselves that, and we acknowledge not everyone will buy that, but we're thinking it's kind of strictly weaker ideology. So we thought, well, you know, the metaphysicians are like that, and they'll think it's cool. And don't forget, I mean, natural properties are in a way not dropping out altogether of the natural regularity idea, because after all, the benchmark of finite propositions is given by the book of the world. That's kind of a way of getting at that space. And then what we say is, oh, but you can obey finite regularity for that space if you're working with a different language. But we're still using the language of metaphysics to define what the finite propositions are. So we can't be too quick to just say, hey, natural properties are playing no role there. I think it's actually a little trickier than that. On the symmetry thing, I think I'm sensitive to Veronica's point. One little thing that's kind of interesting is that the notion of symmetry is the natural symmetries is actually strictly weaker than the notion of natural properties, because we can have different Carnot bases generate the same symmetries. So there's an interesting intermediate thing there that metaphysicians haven't sort of cottoned onto very much, which is something that's not as watered down as just qualitative, but where you've got the notion of natural symmetries that doesn't go all the way to have to make selections as to which properties are natural and which not. Now, I know that doesn't speak to the worry. I'll just pick on one other thing from 1971 Carnot that I think is very interesting. In 1947, the question arose to Carnot, okay, he was onto this instantial. I think he was onto the difference between instantial and generalization projectable in a way Goodman wasn't. But that's a historical thing, and we can debate that. He then posed himself the question, okay, which properties have instantial relevance? He gave an answer that looks like a terrible answer, which is, oh, all the qualitative ones. And then, you know, that can't be right in a finite model. You know, learning that something's the only red thing, if we're just having any old qualitative property being the only red thing, that's really bad news for the next guy having that property. So in a finite model, terrible. One thing that turns out very interesting, and where you're really using something quite watered down, and by 1971, people were working with the idea, various ideas of Carnot to the effect, proposals to the effect, let's not have one all-purpose recipe for getting priors, but let's see what certain constraints on priors will buy you. One interesting constraint that he worked with was what we could call finite symmetry. What this says is if you've got a certain credence in a world, then any finite permutation of that world, where just finitely many things switch places, you should have the same credence in the finite permutation from the point of view of the priors. That's what finite symmetry gives you. And then Geifman and Humberg in around this time independently proved something quite remarkable, which is, I mean, it might not be remarkable when you really bear down on it, but it sounds pretty cool, which is in an infinite domain. Well, they did it for countable, and then Jeff was working on extending it to uncountable. And then there's never a case where a qualitative property disconfirms the hypothesis that the next thing has it. No case. Intrinsic, extrinsic, take any qualitative property whatsoever in a countable domain. You're not going to get a counterexample out of being the only red thing, because any particular thing already had prior 0 in these models of being the only red thing. So that's part of the trick. But it's still quite striking that you never get something being negatively relevant to the next instance. And then under various, then there's the question, what sort of mild extra constraints can you add to guarantee certain kinds of positive relevance? None of that requires any of these global symmetry ideas. They're kind of, you can see how they develop out of those ideas. So I think it's kind of instructive to map that development, to see how each stage of that, I mean, I just, again, by the way, put the whole thing in a language that wasn't the way that these theorems were being proved, but the thing that I said could be proved using essentially the same resources. And it's sort of instructive to see how these things develop and how non-language dependent theorems can be reconstructed from this Carnapian history in a way that I think is potentially extremely illuminating.
We have 9 minutes. There's no need to stop right here. So.
I want to say something in favor of the proposal that you dismissed about, oh, simple hypotheses in natural terms are better. I was thinking there's a very straightforward version of developing that doesn't run into the problem, which is that you're thinking of hypotheses as hypotheses about what the laws say, and so you assume the laws are sentences in some language with all and only natural properties, and then you just have some kind of prior that says, oh, the simpler, the higher probability, you need to make it normalizable, but that's not an issue.
So the paper looks very different to the talk. In the talk, I picked on a disastrous version of the simplicity idea that Kian and I had warned against that seems to have some life. In the actual paper, we look at a series, well, we look at 1 or 2 versions of the simplicity idea and gesture at others. So one whole program is to do with Solmanov induction, where you talk about the simplicity of writing programs that generate probabilistic laws that's that generate the true chances. That's not a long way from the sort of thing that you're onto.
This is the non-language, the one that is where you're fixing a language, the natural properties, because I think Solomon wasn't doing that.
Yes. So a lot of you can take each of these simplicity theoretic ideas and have a book of the world spin on them. You're right. And the book of the world spin on various of the ideas. There's the idea that Kian had that's in our naturalness paper, where it's about the how natural is the probability distribution. That was which is measured by how simple is the recipe to state for generating a certain creedal distribution, and you do simplicity ranking on that, if I remember. That's roughly the idea. So that's another idea. Another idea that you could make work a little bit, at least in finite worlds, is look at the simplicity of the entire world description and then rank your credence in worlds on the simplicity of the entire world description. So I agree with you that there's a variety of ways of playing out the simplicity idea. I picked on a bad one. The slogan, the intuitive idea has more legs than I led on.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you understand qualitative, non-qualitative distinction. Like I get that it's dialectically okay to help yourself to it. Friends of naturalness will probably like it, but once you there are these metaphorical ways of talking about whether the property contains an object as a constituent that makes it non-qualitative. But how you can understand that? Because one way that you might go is you have to do something like the metaphysical semantics and look at the representation of the property in the language of metaphysics and see whether there's an entity mentioned there or something. And then if we're looking for objects in the definition versus measuring the length of the definition here at the front, if you're doing it, if you like the scale of naturalness, those two things aren't ideologically that different, right? And I was also just wondering, making the distinction in like an intentionalist framework where you identify equivalent properties is going to be even more difficult because you're not going to be able to like, you know, take this talk of like the property containing or mentioning the object.
So I like intentionalism about properties, facts, all of that. I think that most ideas about containment are, if you wrote them down properly, incoherent. And so you know, I know you know that's where I'm coming from. So I certainly wouldn't want to go big time on structural ideas about constituency for properties. One thing to note about the book of the world idea is, in a way, it's a cheat, because you're talking about do you need to have names in the, but you know, if we don't have a sense of whether the predicates in the book of the world are qualitative or not, it doesn't help us very much. You know, if there was Norwegian in there, then it wouldn't be so great that, you could just say it in one word in the. So I feel there's some background idea of the predicates in the book of the world being qualitative that's driving that in the first place. So I don't think it's as promising. It's as easy to escape from the fundamental ideology of quality as I think by taking this detour through the book of the world. You know, got to start somewhere. It seems like just my judgment call is it doesn't seem too bad to spot myself that and work with it. But I mean, as I said to Barry, I could certainly respect someone who really wanted to bear down on this and say that it doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But I don't think intentionalism makes the thing crash at all.
Well, that talk would have been enjoyable and informative no matter who gave it. So that makes it sort of qualitatively good. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to say? All right. So thank you very much.